To wrap up, big ideas, problem behavior is not random. Right? It happens for a reason. We have a deterministic worldview. The world happens according to rules, unfolds according to rules. And to address problem behavior, our first question when we see it should be, what's the function? Not what do I do about it? That is an important question. You need to have a plan, but it needs to be informed by what's the function? And those are our 4 functions of behavior, right? 4 big takeaways. This is how you simplify your analysis of problems. You ask what's the function, and then you try to parse it down to one of these 4 camps. This will lead to a functional approach to addressing problem behavior and a scientifically informed, likely more effective approach for intervening on it if you ask those questions first. So I'm going to end with a message of optimism for parents and for teachers. If you look at antecedent behavior consequence, well, the antecedent is my home if I'm the parent. The antecedent is my classroom if I'm the teacher or the educational assistant. The student is responsible for their behavior in this equation, in this ABC, right? The student's control is for behavior, but then the consequences that are encountered are also under the control of the adults, the parent in the home, the staff in the school. So when you do the math, right, we have 2/3 of the control over the learning contingencies. Students' problem behavior is just one of a 3-part variable. And to me, that's really a message of optimism. If we can exercise our control and strategies, and Dr. Kern-Kagel shared some strategies this morning, with an emphasis on prevention, right? I can manipulate and manage the antecedents and teach new skills and manage the consequences and not feed the problem behavior anymore. That's where the solutions are going to emerge. This is how people see problem behavior initially, quite often, parents and staff at schools, right? They don't see their power with the antecedents and consequences. They just see this great, big, overwhelming B, right? This huge problem behavior that seems to be all-encompassing and, oh my goodness, what are we possibly going to do about this? It's so bad, right? That's overwhelming, and that leads to the wrong initial questions of how do I respond to the big B? When really, this is the message we should be sending, right? You have all this power. You are the antecedents. You are the consequences. This is a message of power, and this is a message of optimism. I think this is important for teaching staff. This is important for parents, right? Because if I understand WTF, what's the function, then I can stop feeding it on the consequence end. And even more importantly, I can teach new ways to satisfy the hunger. And that's really the crux of positive behavior support overall, is an educative intervention to teach new behaviors to replace problem behaviors, new communicative repertoires. And the effect on problem behavior should be that it continues to go down and you've successfully intervened on that problem behavior.
I'm going to take this opportunity, Richard, to ask you a question. When we think of families working with behavior consultants in the home environment, I've found critical is when the family can be effective in one thing, and it gives them courage that they can address other issues concerning their child, whether it's toileting, eating, or whatever. In the school environment, because you work in a lot of school environments, how do you inspire teaching staff who have maybe lost all hope that they can be effective? How do you, with a particular child, how do you inspire them? Where do you start?
That's a great question, and sometimes a difficult thing to do when they're thinking back to, right, this is what they're seeing, the school staff, right? This is how big the problem is. One of the things that I would try to encourage them, one of the things we'll often hear from school staff is, well, it would be better here if the parents could manage it at home, right? And kind of blame the home, and if the home did a better job, it would be better at school. And as Dr. Kern-Kagel said this morning, ideally, yes, everyone would be on the same page, and you would have good overlap and consistency between homes, but that's not critical, right? So one of the messages of optimism, I think, is that problem behavior is contextual. It occurs for a purpose in that environment. And even if you can't help the home or you can't help other settings, or you can't even help other locations in the school, in any given classroom, that's its own unique environment. It has its own antecedents, its own consequences. And you can start to evoke change on a context by context, activity routine by activity routine basis. Right? That is possible. It can be difficult, right? Especially if everything else is kind of status quo problematic around you, but it's not impossible. And you need to start somewhere. And often just starting with one routine where you can kind of get some buy-in and say, that did work here, it is better here, they can start to have some optimism that it can expand beyond.
We have one questioner up here, and I encourage to stand up and ask her and line up. Go ahead.
I'm just curious to know if there's any possibility or reconsideration of using the word problem, because my son, when he went to school, kindergarten and grade 1, I was sending a little boy to school that I thought was perfect. He was always good at home. There was no behavioral problems. And suddenly I was getting phone calls from the school repetitively, like sometimes twice, 3 times a week, saying, I'm sorry, your son's having behavioral problems. And so I would show up at the school and ask what the problems were. And they were sort of the textbook, hitting his head, that sort of thing. But he wasn't, from my perspective, perceived as having problems as such. But within a different environment, he was acting differently. And so it came to a head when the principal finally said, we are going to send him to a special school for children with behavioral problems. And I, being his mother, was very defensive and very offended that they even had used the word problem behavior. And I know in retrospect that's part of the protocol, but I'm thinking for young mothers who are told their children have problems when they maybe don't want to be labeled as such. This was before there was any mention of autism or Asperger's, or he turns out he had type 1 diabetes. And so I was told I had this child with problem behaviors, and I just saw red. So I'm wondering if there's any academic possibility of deleting the word problem and just saying, I can't think of an alternative, but it's not affirmative.
Right. No, thank you for that question. That's a good question. I think that this is a values-driven question, right? There's different people in different settings who feel very strongly about what do we call this? Do we call it disruptive behavior? Do we call it challenging behavior? Do we call it challenging behavior? Problem behavior? What I've seen in my experience and practice is it's a reflection of individuals' personal values. I've been to some schools where there are values in the schools, we don't like to call it problem behavior. We'll call it challenging behavior or this or that. I've been to other schools who will say, no, it's a problem. It's a problem for the individual engaging in it. It's a problem for everybody else. We're going to call a spade and call it a problem behavior. So it's really context by context, values driven, what people choose to do. In terms of the science of behavior, how do we approach it? There isn't a conventional agreement on what we call it, right? That doesn't exist. Different publications, different authors, different locations will use different terms synonymously.
We have another question here from Orly. Any tips for school avoidance? I remember my own son wouldn't go to school. It was a difficult time, and they had his SEA pick him up in his little Beetle.
Well, that's cool.
That was pretty cool. It got him to school, but do you have any other tips other than the Volkswagen Bug?
Ferrari. Simple. Put that in the school budget.
Yeah.
This morning, Dr. Kernkegel talked about motivation, right? And if school is inherently a demanding place to go, my daughter's in grade 9 now. I drop her off every morning, and every morning we have the same conversation. What are you doing today? And some days, what she's doing today at school is, I've got a math test, and then this, and then this, and school's going to suck today, right? And the next day, I've got gym, and I'm excited we're going swimming. So, across the neurotypical spectrum as well, kids have different degrees of school avoidance. It's not uncommon. But really, it is inherently about motivation. And motivation is something that is under the control of the adults, that we can get together and be clever and think about. And you saw some strategies this morning. How do we make it appealing to go? What am I going to? Right? I've worked with some kids in the past where as soon as they were dropped off at school, they faced here's your schedule for the day. And the schedule is primarily demand, some breaks thrown in. And that's how they started the day. Right? Welcome here. And the change to it was kind of and some schools actually do this as a tier 1 strategy, a soft start. Everybody comes in and you can have center time, book time. We spend the first 30 minutes just settling in. You don't come in and get straight down to trigonometry or whatever it happens to be. And so think about what am I arriving at school to, and exercising the control and power we do have over those variables, and using a soft start or an individualized soft start so that it's not I'm going to school to find demands, but it's I'm going to school to get this cool, fun thing to start with. And of course, people say, well, you can't do that forever. Like, that's true, you can't do that forever. And eventually, if you're going to work, you got to go to work in the future. But you have to start somewhere. And so it would be, and that's one of the kind of themes of positive behavior support is start small, build change, and expand that change. It's not a one-hit wonder. It's evolutionary and developmental over time.
When you have a child that's on the spectrum and has like extreme behavioral outbursts that can be triggered by anything, and they're really good at coming up with excuses for why they're still maintaining their upset and their outburst, where do you start? I've tried avoidance, I've tried engaging, I've tried placating, I've tried redirecting. Where do you start to tame the beast?
Your student can defend their own behavior?
Oh, no, she's 4, she's my child.
Oh, okay.
And she's got a twin sibling on the spectrum. So there's like a balancing act, and
Right.
where do you start?
One of the things I usually start with in a public talk like this is say it's unethical for me to issue clinical advice to you as a parent to go home and run with because I haven't done proper assessment, right? So I just have to put that out there. But just thinking broadly, it's starting with what's the function, right? Context by context, how is this working for her? What is she getting out of it? And if you have a board-certified behavior analyst supporting home, right, using that resource who knows you and your child to intervene.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't be any more specific. I wish I
Okay.
could wave a magic wand, but it starts with asking the question, what's the function?